Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We're going to go back today and we're going to talk about the topic of tariffs, specifically the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. And Chris, we both teach American history survey classes at the college level, and I told my students just this semester that, when we were talking about tariffs, that, I never thought in my career that I would see a point where tariffs were actually relevant to people's day-to-day lives. And here we are in 2025, not just talking about tariffs in the academic sense, but also talking about tariffs because they are now in the news almost every day.
The one thing that's really going on is that in America, we buy goods from other countries. We are very involved in other nations. You can look at the back of your t-shirt, you can look at cars. We are dependent on other countries. And one of the things is that tariffs, many people might not know of a tariff, but they are aware of a tax, because one of the most frustrating things about life are taxes. And so when you look at a tariff, it's a tax, and we need to be aware of these tariffs, and especially the Smoot-Hawley tariff, because, right, it affects our everyday life, no matter how you look at it. And when you see these countries get into these squabbles and these war of words and actions, it's going to filter its way down to the average consumer and the various products that we purchase. It is a trade barrier, if you will, that causes businesses to suffer as well as consumers.
Yeah. Now, Chris, I know you've seen, and I know our listeners have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Bueller,
Yeah.
Bueller.
Bueller. And if our listeners don't remember this, they need to go back and watch that scene in the classroom where the teacher, and I cannot remember the guy's name, the guy who plays the teacher, but he's talking, and I've got the transcript here. Yes, I looked this up. And he said this is what he's doing in the scene. He's standing at the front of the classroom in front of the chalkboard, and of course, this is the 1980s, so you got a bunch of kids who were probably actually technically older than us at the time, 1980s looking kids, looking bored, chewing gum and stuff like that, which of course we know nothing about, do we?
Right.
And he says in 1930, and of course he's talking to this deadpan voice, the Republican controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the anyone, anyone,
Anyone?
Great Depression, passed the anyone tariff bill, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And, he goes on and on and on. And sometimes, like I said a minute ago, before this semester, when you talk about tariffs, it's sort of talk like, what he's talking about. Kids weren't interested in tariffs. It's sort of like this past week, I was talking about the Granger movement, the farm protest movement, and you can just see their eyes glaze over no matter how hard you work to make it interesting. It's just not a topic that they can really relate to. But now, thanks to what's going on in the world today, people are more aware of what tariffs are, and they're not as bored by them because they're more interested in, well, how is this going to affect me when I go to buy my new cell phone? Or how is this going to affect me when I, go to buy my new car, or whatever the case may be?
Because the reality is that companies are going to pass the cost of tariffs off to consumers. And so, if you are going to see tariffs, when we look at the Smoot-Hawley, but we'll look at this aspect. The federal government, more specifically the president of the United States, feels that America is not is getting cheated off of revenue and off of money. And so the quickest fix to this is to make, we'll say Canada and Mexico, because they're in the news right now. It's to make any product that is made in Canada and export it to America or import it into America have to pay a tax. And that's designed for America to get more money. However, what's going to happen with that is, this amount of tax that is put on milk or what other products it is. Well, the companies are going to have to absorb that cost, and so they are then going to pass it down to the consumer. And so that is why it doesn't really apply to eggs. That's a whole other story that's in the news right now, but it does apply to, this idea of cars. I saw an article the other day that said if tariffs could, the average American can spend about $12,000 more for the cost of a vehicle because of these tariffs or taxes that is going to be charged. So it is important that we understand the history behind it, but also the currency of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to 1930 and talk a little bit about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. Um, so Chris, I'm just going to ask you a question. I know you know the answer, but I'm going to ask you, who's president of the United States in 1929?
Well, in the wonderful world of 1929, when we start to come together, you're going to have good old Herbert Hoover that's going to
Herbert
be
Hoover.
around there.
Herbert Hoover, and he's not,
Herbert Hoover.
and Mr. Hoover is not related to the vacuum cleaner. I don't think so anyway. But anyway, he comes into office, Republican Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression hits in 1929. So there are some people who say the the Smoot-Hawley tariff caused the Great Depression, but it didn't. The Great Depression was already, fully engaged by the time the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act comes along. Um, and basically, what you have in 1930 um, was these two men. One was a senator by the name of Reed Smoot, and the other was a representative, member of the House of Representatives, Willis Hawley. And they were concerned, interestingly enough, about farm prices, that they needed to maybe increase some tariffs on goods coming into farm related goods coming into the United States. And that's where this sort of all started. But of course, it ended in a totally different place. Yeah.
Well, go ahead. I was just going to say, the thing is that these individuals, I would say, are kind of doing the same thing that maybe it is happening in current. They are trying to find a way that they can have a protectionist trade policy,
Right.
which basically protects what America is trading and what America is receiving. And the problem is that they go a little too far. I do think that if they would have done a gradual implementation of these tariffs or of these taxes, people can usually take a penny tax. A penny tax, people don't like it. It's bad. It's extra money. But a penny tax is a whole lot better than, say, a dime tax. But if somebody comes and says, "Hey, we're going to add, a quarter tax to your personal property," people are going to be offended by that. And I think what happens with Smoot-Hawley is that it's the amount that they try to put into this, because it is such a steep increase on these tariffs, and people were kind of caught unaware. You have the depression, you've got these things going on, and it's actually going to harm the nation instead of help, especially when you talk about farmers and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, the country was already in a Great Depression. The last thing the country needed, the last thing the world needed at this particular point in time in 1930 was this huge tax increase on goods being imported into the United States. And Herbert Hoover wasn't sure about this. I think he understood. I mean, he was a business guy, wasn't he? He understood to some degree that this might not be all that good. I think he was concerned that maybe the tariff was going too far. He was getting letters from people like Henry Ford and others saying, let's not be so hasty. Let's not do this. But at the same time, he's a Republican who Smoot-Hawley are Republicans. So he's hesitant to veto this Republican legislation and ultimately signs it on June 17, 1930. And Chris, it's instant what happens. It pretty much freezes international trade because what happens, as you talked about earlier, was the United States raised its tariff. So all these other countries start raising their tariff, and it now becomes much more expensive, to import and export products from one nation to another. And of course, when you have an economy in the United States and around the world that was already in depression, that's not something you really need.
Well, and the other thing is that he was hesitant to veto it because he had promised when he was running for president that he was going to increase tariffs on
Yeah.
agricultural products. He was trying to look after the farmers, and he said, "Hey, if you guys vote for me, I'll come into office and I'll put tariffs on agricultural products that are being sent here to kind of help you guys out." So, yes, he couldn't do anything about it because that was a campaign promise of his, and people put him in office expecting that. So he comes in and he does it. And I find it interesting because just about all Republicans agreed that this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
There's a few Democrats that agree, but for the most part, Democrats disagree. In society, you have a lot of Republicans who believe tariffs are the way to go. You have a lot of Democrats who believe that it's not the way to go, and it's causing a lot of angst and animosity, even in Capitol Hill. So he had no choice. He had to go ahead and accept it, even though all these economists said this is the dumbest thing that America could do. This is not right, and you really need to stop it. I think somebody said that it is economic stupidity was the quote that was used if you do not veto it. However, he had to do it. I remember there was a illustration that said that the head of like J.P. Morgan, this big financial corporation, went to Herbert Hoover and basically said, quote, "I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto the asinine Hawley-Smoot tariff."
Mhm.
Not well liked. And even though he didn't like it, well, he had no choice. He had to go along with it because that's his people.
Yeah, he backed himself into a corner. And historically speaking, you know this, Chris, Republicans throughout the 19th century, especially since the Civil War, have been when the Republican Party didn't form till right before the Civil War. But before the Civil War, Whigs, mainly Northern Whigs, were pro high tariff. After the Civil War, the Republican Party was pro high tariff. You see this with uh, William McKinley. So Herbert Hoover, when he signed this, even though he did have some questions about it, he is within the what I could call Republican tradition of the late 19th into the early to mid 20th century of promoting these high tariffs. And in this particular case, it did immense harm to the United States economy, which was already struggling, and higher prices meant it was going to become more difficult for people to buy the things they needed. So it was going to make life more difficult for Americans during the Great Depression. Now, it's not surprising, or it shouldn't be surprising to our listeners, that when Herbert Hoover runs for president, he loses. I mean, Chris, you can't really blame him for the Great Depression, I don't think, but you can certainly blame him for his response to the Great Depression, and you can blame him for signing this tariff in the midst of the Great Depression. It may have hurt the economy during the best of times, but during the worst of times, it was the worst thing you could have done.
Because tariffs simply do not work, because it's kind of like when we were talking in the 1960s of MAD, mutual assured destruction.
Yeah.
If you go put a tax on Canada, Canada's going to put a tax on you. It's just common sense. And what happens in May of 1930, the most loyal trading partner to the United States was Canada, and they retaliated. And they basically put a tax on American products, which was about 30% of U.S. exports to Canada. And so there you go. You have this outright trade war. And then France and Britain, they begin finding other people who have the same products. And instead of trading with America, they go towards to them. And at the end of the day, Smoot-Hawley, while the initiative was thought to be good, the reality was it was a terrible decision to make.
And it's not a tariff, but it somewhat reminds me, the Smoot-Hawley tariff reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's Embargo Act. What was that, 1803? I think it was 1803. And, you know, the Jefferson administration, like many Americans, were irritated by Britain and France harassing American shipping and stuff. So Congress passes and Jefferson signs this Embargo Act, which effectively shut down trade. And yes, it hurt Britain, it hurt France, but more than that, it hurt the United States because those other countries could go, well, we'll find somewhere else to get some of this stuff. The United States had basically shut its doors to trade, and it had a negative effect on the economy, mainly the New England economy. And so, you know, you look at something like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, I sometimes think about that Embargo Act, that it was a knee-jerk response. The Embargo Act was that really hurt the economy. And here in the midst of the Great Depression, you have the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which does the same thing. Now, when the election comes about, of course, Herbert Hoover loses. Surprise, surprise. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, comes in, and Democrats also take control of the House and Senate. And so the Smoot-Hawley Tariff dies under Franklin Roosevelt's administration.
Well, you see, unemployment went from 8% to 15%.
Yeah.
You also see, that yes, I think we need to be careful that we're all not always doom and gloom, because for a short period of time, it does actually work. You start to see more increase in productivity. You see some construction contracts that begin to rise. Payroll begins to rise, more workers. So at the beginning, it looks good. However, it's just a short-term win, because ultimately, when Canada put their own tariffs on American goods, then you have to start cutting cost again, and you have to start laying people off, and then you start having that issue. And so I think it's a great topic, because Smoot-Hawley, we talk about history you didn't know but should. I hope leaders have looked at the pluses and the minuses for the Smoot-Hawley while they're thinking about how to handle the current economic situation.
Yeah.
I think we have, it's kind of like we've done podcast on 100 days and the president's job in 100 days and all of these things. And you want to fulfill campaign promises, but sometimes, not to use current language, but you can go out there with a chainsaw instead of with a scalpel. That sometimes you try too hard to make something work, and you start cutting and you start adding, and next thing you know, you have chaos, and you have harm instead of good. Are we being treated fairly by other nations in the world? Probably not. But do you go out and start throwing tariffs and hoping something sticks just to think that somebody will cave into you? We're in a different world today. During the Great Depression, you were coming off a world war. You had another world war that was going to begin in a little bit. Nowadays, I just don't know if tariffs are the best approach.
No, and we aren't in a depression right now. We're not even in a recession, but inflation has been high in the past few years, as everybody knows. But yeah, I mean, we could definitely see inflation, recession if these tariffs cause retaliatory tariffs, which could ultimately hurt the markets. So, Chris, I think it's a good episode. Relevancy to today, yes, just like we said at the beginning of the episode, that tariffs are something that hadn't been relevant for a long time. Now they are. So there's lessons in history all over and over and over again. There's an old saying that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. So there's lessons from history that probably need to be applied today. And as you said, certainly hope that leaders in the United States and around the world are looking at the Smoot-Hawley tariff and other tariffs to see what happens when certain things are done.
Yes.
So we hope our audience has enjoyed this episode. If you like this episode, please share it with your family and friends. We're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, we are on Anchor FM, and we are in other places where you find your podcast. Please like us and share us and leave a comment. Until next time, I'm Ray, and he's Chris.
I'm Chris.
All right, and we'll talk to you later.